Now, to just try to illustrate this for a second, as Stepan had indicated, you know, I like Rosa Luxemburg very much. Actually, I'm helping to publish her complete works. By the way, it's going to be more than 14 volumes, it turns out. I think it's more like 17 now, because we found 3,000 more pages in Polish that have never been published, so we've got to, we are going to add on a few more volumes, and we're working now on 3 volumes, volumes 3, 4, and 5, which is going to be her writings on revolution, on the 1905, 1917, 1918, 1919 German Revolution and Russian revolutions. And 2/3 of that material is material you've never seen, or maybe 3/4 you've never seen, because it was not republished since, it wasn't even in her German complete works, collected works. And one of the best books by Rosa Luxemburg you can read, by the way, is a book called The Accumulation of Capital, written in 1913, which is a devastating critique of European imperialism. I'm very glad you guys put the word imperialism in the title of this talk, so I can talk about imperialism. And she argued that imperialism is not an accident of Western society, but it's a necessary organic outgrowth of capital accumulation. And she has wonderful, devastating criticism of what European imperialism does to pre-capitalist social formations in Africa, Latin America, Asia. And she has some brilliant discussion of sub-Saharan Africa at a time when nobody back then in Europe was paying much attention to sub-Saharan Africa, or at least in terms of crediting the Africans for having communal indigenous formations that was in advance of what existed in Europe. But, you know, as great as that book is, there is a shortcoming. Rosa Luxemburg never kind of looks into the soul of black folk, to steal a phrase from another great thinker. That is, she doesn't actually ask herself, okay, she looks at racism as a socio-political, economic issue, but she doesn't ask herself what's the psychological impact of racism upon the oppressed in terms of daily interaction. That's missing. Now, that's not missing in Fanon. So what Fanon is suggesting in his effort to grapple with the psychological side as well as the economic side of the problem is that it's not like you can just, so to speak, overthrow capitalism or much less gain political independence for a country trying to be free of Western imperialism, and then because of this anti-colonial, anti-capitalist movement, you're going to necessarily have the chains of racism to be broken. He always argued that we must proceed in tandem by attacking the problem of racism on 2 levels simultaneously. And as he said, it's a huge mistake to prioritize one or the other over the other. You have to attack the economic, political, social roots of the problem, but you also have to confront it in terms of its psychological implications. If you don't see that, doing that in tandem, you're very easily led to do something much of the left has done, and some of it is still doing. Basically, listen, once we get rid of capitalism, all these problems will go away, you know, it'll be fine. There won't be any more sexism or racism or any of this. Let's just, you know, vote for the best socialist and get rid of capitalism, and then what are you crying about? Okay. Well, I mean, this is a problem, I think. This is a problem. This is not just a theoretical problem. This is a problem of how we organize. This is a problem of how we talk to people on picket lines and protests. This is how we think about the world. This is a very fundamental issue here, I think. Now, I think what Fanon's greatness is, though I'm not uncritical of Fanon, and we can bring out some of the points where I think that he didn't get things right, but from his early work, Black Skin, White Mask, to his last book, Wretched of the Earth, his real greatness, I think, was to never let go of the centrality of the interior as well as the exterior impact of race and racism upon the living individual and in the colonial context. And this is not just true of the developing world, of course. We're living in the United States. And Fanon didn't say much about the United States. Why? He never got to the United States until 2 weeks before his death, when he was dying of leukemia, diagnosed with inoperable leukemia at 35 years old. The only place in the world that had a facility that can even treat him, though they had no cure, was in Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. And he finally got in there after the CIA tried to keep him out for a month. They wanted him to die before he got to the United States, and once he got into the United States, he did die. It was very intentional on their part. The CIA knew exactly what they were doing because he was, of course, the United States was on France's side in the vicious war they fought against the Algerian Revolution and the African revolutions. But the point is, he didn't say much about the United States because he was always writing from his situated life experience as a West Indian, then somebody living in France, and then a black man living in Algeria, and then Tunisia, and then traveling through sub-Saharan Africa in the last years of his life. But it is impossible in the United States to deal with class unless you understand that class relations in U.S. history have always been shaped and determined by racial determinations. It's not true of every country in the world, by the way, but it is true in the United States. So to try to and by the way, this is increasingly true in Europe, right? I just came back. Where's our friend from Jonas from Sweden? Okay, yes. I just came back from Norway, and I was a group of African exiles from West Africa sponsored a talk by me there, and they were giving me some horrifying details about the discrimination against African and Middle Eastern exiles in Norway, right? I mean, we're not talking about Hungary, right? We're talking about the most liberal place in Europe, one of the most liberal places. Well, it's got a right-wing government now. But the point is that if you're going to think that race comes second, then how can you deal with the actuality and reality of our own situation here in the United States? So you can't deal adequately with the question of class without, in a certain sense, proceeding on the basis of that wonderful phrase from Hubert Harrison. There are some contexts from the 1920s where race comes first. By the way, he never said race only. He said race comes first. He didn't say race only, okay? And I think, again, a lot of the left needs to learn this lesson. Now, therefore, I'll just more quickly sum up here it's going to be four, several major theoretical insights in Fanon in terms of how he's responding to this general problematic I've been laying out here. First, as I mentioned, racism is not an inevitable part of the human condition, nor is race a natural biological fact of human existence. It is instead a social construction that had emerged for particular historical reasons. Second, by viewing the other, however, in terms of race, which we are trained to do so from the earliest of ages, and in a place like the United States, literally, we know about the studies that this is already by the time a child is 2 years old, children are already programmed to start thinking in these ways and seeing in these ways, is it blocks one of the most fundamental quests of all human beings, this racial classification, and that is to be recognized for your worth as a human being, because you're not seen as who you are, but you are seen as in terms of the epidermal considerations and the prejudices that are attached to it. Now, why is that important? Here's where the Hegel part comes in. Fanon took off from Hegel's wonderful insight that a sense of self is not innate. We don't come into the world with a sense of individuality or a sense of who we are as a self. We can even argue whether such a sense exists before you engage in social interaction. That is, according to Hegel, your sense of self depends upon first being acknowledged or recognized for who you are as a human being by the other, by somebody who you don't even know. The stronger sense of self you have is a result, ironically enough, of being acknowledged by those who are outside of yourself. This is the entire, what's developed by Hegel in his master-slave dialectic in terms of the dialectic of recognition. Racism, of course, blocks that recognition, right? Because you're not viewed, you're not recognized for who you are, you're simply stereotyped according to a set of categories, which means what? You also don't gain a true sense of your selfhood because you're frustrated in your ability to be recognized by the other. And this creates all sorts of problems in the victim of racism. It also creates all kinds of problems in the perpetrator of racism. Although whites rarely notice this because they gain perhaps economically from racial discrimination. Generally they do. And that is the second most important insight Hegel has. Recognition is always reciprocal, mutual. You can't get recognition from the other unless you are willing to give recognition in turn to the other and vice versa. It's always a reciprocal process. So if the white does not give recognition to the black, well, then of course, the white's not going to get the recognition they intuitively desire in turn. And therefore, their sense of self, their psychic structure is warped as well. But they don't recognize the warped nature of it, and therefore they vote for Donald Trump. Okay. So, or all kinds of other neurotic and pathological symptoms come out. So the point here is that Fanon is very interested in how this denial of recognition plays out. Now, he's primarily looking at the victims of racism in terms of this, But he never simply only looked there. He was also very interested in how this also plays out in terms of the perpetrators of racism. So the only way out, how do you break out of this cycle? Because it's like, it becomes kind of a slippery slope of kind of a bad infinity, right? Because you want desperately to be recognized by the other, but the other is not recognizing you for who you are, but you still want to be recognized by the other. So what do? Very often you become fixated on the other. We see this also in gender relationships, right? In love relationships, very often fixation, right? Overemphasis on the other. You constantly want that, please tell me, do you love me? Do you love me, right? Well, if you have to say it too many times, something's wrong, right? I mean, you doth protest too much, okay? So the point here is that for Fanon, when you are in that kind of a situation, it's a tremendously frustrating kind of never-ending cycle. How do you break your way out of this cycle? Well, ultimately, you have to break out of this cycle by doing what? Recognizing something actually Hegel didn't catch. See, Hegel was talking about the master-slave relationship, but he wasn't talking about white masters and black slaves. He wasn't thinking in terms of that, I don't think. He was thinking about, historically, he was looking at the thousands of years of European history, where most of European history, slaves were not black. By the way, who were slaves most of European history? Whites. The word Slav and slave were almost the same word in English, because most slaves in the Roman Empire were Slavs, right? And matter of fact, the Romans thought that the dumber you were was if you were blonde, had blonde hair and blue eyes, that was the less intelligent you had, and the darker skin you had meant you were more intelligent. They had their own racial stereotypes. And by the way, it was a little bit justified, because when they looked south, they saw these great civilizations in Egypt and Nubia and Libya and Mesopotamia, but they looked north and they saw the English running around worshiping these strange druids, and they thought, they can't be that bright. Anyhow, I'm not endorsing that view. But okay, in any case, the point I'm trying to get at here is you have to break out of this endless quest to be acknowledged by the other, because what Hegel doesn't see, Fanon says, is that when the slave is black, the master doesn't care about getting recognition from the black. What the master wants from the black, because they don't view the black slave as even human, the object of property. So what they want from the black slave is not recognition. They want work. Give me my luxury goods, right? Provide me with my goods and services. That's what the white master wants. Of course, this hurts the white master indirectly as well, but they don't recognize that. They don't see that. So what Fanon is saying, it's futile to keep appealing to the master to be acknowledged. At a certain point, you have to say, basta, right? You have to say, I have to turn my gaze away from the master. I have to turn my gaze away from the oppressive authority and no longer appeal to that class or racial grouping to appeal for my liberation. Instead, I have to appeal to who? I have to appeal to those of my own kind who are going through the same suffering that I am going through, and how I have to gain recognition from them. And how do I get recognition from them? By taking pride in the very things I have in common with them. And what do I have in common with them? Well, in this case, my blackness, right? Or my ethnic characteristics, or whatever they may have be, or my gender, right? And you take pride, you transform the negative attribute of being black into something to be proud of, so that you can gain a social sense of cohesion that can both give you greater political power in battling the system, but it can also overcome the barriers to mutual recognition on this interpersonal level. So long before the slogan "Black is Beautiful" became popular later in the 60s, long before even blacks called themselves blacks, or still called themselves Negroes, right? Fanon really nailed this as a crucial moment in the recovery of one's subjective sense of selfhood. And that becomes the energizing force also, he argues, in the anti-colonial struggle, although now he moves and names it more specifically as national consciousness. That is, you gain a sense of national consciousness. Not all forms of national liberation are inherently reactionary, right? Here's another one where my dear Rosa, I think, got it wrong. And argues that you gain a sense, you develop national consciousness, national pride with others of your subordinate kind like yourself, and this enables you to overcome the psychic characteristics and the psychic distress that he actually spends much of his life as a psychiatrist studying and analyzing and trying to cure people of. Now, why does that become important for us today? And I'll try to finish up with this. And that is, look, we have a problem. The problem is failed revolutions. There ain't a good track record. We've seen a lot of seemingly very wonderful revolutions against capitalism that created some of the most horrible regimes history has ever seen. I don't have to go through the crimes of Stalin or the Soviet Union or of Mao, who killed even more than Stalin, if that's possible, but he managed to do it. Not to mention what's happened in Latin America, what's happened in many so-called Marxist-Leninist regimes in Africa. But of course, this goes further than that. It's also what Fanon himself talks about in his last book, The Wretched of the Earth, where he warns at the very moment African independence or gaining independence from European colonialism, that in a certain sense, the real problem is yet to come. Because if they do not rethink the pathway forward in such a way, as he argues, to skip the bourgeois phase of development, that is, to figure out how to go from a pre-capitalist or only partially underdeveloped capitalist relations to a socialist society without having a prolonged period suffering the ills of capitalistic industrialization or neocolonialism, if they don't figure out how to do that, to skip what he calls the bourgeois democratic phase, then there will not only be a lack of progress in those newly independent countries, he argues they will revert backward very quickly into what he calls tribalism, political corruption, single-party states, and ultimately, his words, endless interreligious warfare between Christians and Muslims, especially in North Africa. 1961. Not a bad prediction. Wow. Now, I should add one other footnote here, and that is when Fanon discusses this in The Wretched of the Earth, he does something that I didn't notice until I reread the book for how many times, writing the chapter, and that is, he says, I am here addressing the question that has been debated intensely going back 50 years ago. So I scratched my head and I said, now who is debating this question of skipping the bourgeois democratic phase of revolution 50 years ago? 1961 minus 50 is 1911. It's the Second International, right? It's Trotsky, it's Luxemburg, it's Lenin, it's Ryazanov, it's all of these people who are arguing over whether an underdeveloped country like Russia really does have to do what some of the older orthodox Marxists like Plekhanov argued. No, you got to go through 50 or 100 more years of capitalism before Russians would be ready to get yourself up to the level of being able to create a social society. And we know for a fact that one thing he carried around endlessly when he picked it up copies in Paris, he picked up the first 4 congresses of the Communist International, of the CI. You know, it's been translated now by John Riddell. And Alice Turkey, who was one of his best friends, says in her memoir, he says he carried those 4 volumes around everywhere and kept reading them and rereading them. So something was going on in his head. Now he dies at 35. He doesn't work all this out in detail in any of his books, but he's clearly referring to a question here which I think speaks to our predicament today, and that is, well, how do you make a revolution, first in an underdeveloped society that doesn't stop at mere political independence with a middle-class leadership in charge? How do you get that revolution to continue until a new humanism is actually established, until it's not just a change of political power relations, but a transformation of human relations? Because that's what socialism is. If socialism is not a theory of liberation, I don't know what it's supposed to be, okay? If it's just nationalized property and state control of industry, and we're paying this amount of taxes and against that amount of taxes, well, what's the point of fighting for that? It's got to be a much more fundamental transformation. But not just for the developing world, because in the so-called technologically developed world, this whole problem of revolutions that turn into their opposite or revolutionary movements that stall halfway, when they don't find their way to a new humanism or don't even have a perspective of a fundamental humanist transformation, this is what Fanon was most of all concerned about, and what he basically argued. Any radical movement, any revolutionary movement that does not constantly ask yourself, how does this struggle, how does this movement, how does this campaign, how does this revolution actually create new human relations and break down the most fundamental, intimate, alienated relations of everyday life? If those questions are not posed and worked out, the task is just a waste of time in the final analysis. Those are my words, but I think that's what he's basically saying. So I'm not trying to suggest that these are the only influences on Fanon, by the way. Of course, he was also very influenced by many thinkers in the black world and the negritude movement, and we can talk about other thinkers in the African context that also fed into his thought and became of critical determinants in working out his ideas. But I think when we read Fanon in light of our present predicament, it's not that he has the answer for us, and it's not that he got everything right. He made some false calls in Africa on a couple of places. We can talk about that too in the discussion, like his false call in Angola. Somehow he got that wrong, and some of his comments on well, not what he said about South Africa, but what he didn't say about South Africa. But but there's definitely, even with those faults, and all thinkers have them, because, you know, this is not Bible worship here, right? Well, even Bible worship, you're supposed to have a critical reading, so X that out. But in any case, the point is, at least the right kind, the point is that Fanon is one of the few thinkers of the 20th century that, and here he's like Luxemburg, that thought, because don't forget about her critique of the Bolsheviks after 1917, it was a searing critique, you know, for their suppression of democracy, of Lenin and Trotsky. He thought very hard about the question of what happens after the revolution, something that has to be addressed even before it occurs. And we are now at a very, very critical moment where a new generation of anti-racist activists has emerged in the last year or two, really a new generation. I've been so immensely impressed with some of these young black and Latino activists, and white activists as well, that have been part of these protests and these campaigns, that even saw an indication of it in the anti-Trump protest a few days ago in Chicago. I haven't seen anything like this. I mean, it even goes further than Occupy. It's really remarkable. And what's really magnificent is, as I brought one of the representatives of Black Youth Project 100 to my campus 3 weeks ago to give a talk on the struggle against police abuse. And somebody asked him from the audience, how do you define your organization? Because I'm not quite sure what Black Youth Project 100 means. Let me say a little bit about it. How do you define your organization? What's its purpose? And he said, it's to look at the world through a black, feminist, queer lens. And I got up in the discussion, I asked, could you spell out what that means? And he said, we're trying to work out what that means. We're not sure yet. But he said, we want to avoid the problems of earlier black liberation movements that kind of put feminism either on the back burner or actually were anti-feminist. But we also want to avoid the problems of other groups in the past that didn't integrate questions of queer identity and struggles against the repression of people's ability to choose their sexual orientation and express it, etc. And they're having discussions in their groups about how to forge a lens that would look at these three things. This is not just an academic debate about intersectionality, right? This is a little bit more down to earth, maybe influenced in part by some of that discussion, but I think it actually in some ways goes beyond it. And I think, well, Fanon himself didn't go there perhaps, but I think that this shows that there is something very, a maturity of our age that we have to recognize, that as much as everything is moving backwards, and I don't have to tell you there's a lot of reason to be depressed right now, but there's also some really exciting things that are happening, and hopefully rereading and discussing and debating Fanon's work can help us address the questions that are coming from a new generation. Thank you.